This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of Conceptual Heist, Ménage 3, and Smash Monstrous. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we're two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
And for our April show, Sean and I are going to be looking at two current ongoing and one already completed webcomic, as we do every month. We're going to begin with J. Gisele and Matt G. Gagnon's Conceptual Heist. After that, we're going to look at a very popular webcomic we haven't even discussed yet, and we've been around for over 2 years now, and that is Ménage 3 by Gisele Lagace and David Lumsdon. And then we're going to wrap up with Chris Bolton and Kyle Bolton's Smash story, Monstrous. But before we get to those webcomics, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by their great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some wonderful specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes even 50% off cover. But occasionally, you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And since we're a webcomics podcast, we also have to point a finger at the electronic side of things, too. We also like to highlight mydigitalcomics.com, their sister site, for all your electronic comics interests. They have a lot of the great publishers that you love, too. Action Labs, Image Comics, all sorts of fun guys, Top Cow. And just about everything they've got is in a DRM-free format, which is definitely something that I'm all for. Causes fewer problems across the board on everything. The other benefit, too, is that any purchase that you make on mydigitalcomics.com earns 5% back towards your DCBS purchase. So you get kind of a 2-for-1 deal out of that. It's a great setup, worth checking them out if you're into your comics from an electronic format.
That's right, and whether you like your comics electronic or in hard copy, you can't go wrong with the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service or their sister company, My Digital Comics. That's dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. Well, how are things going with you, Sean?
It is a busy month here, keeping up. We're kind of ramping up with the convention season, as you know, and trying to get things organized and sorted on where and when we all get to go everywhere and wherever.
Or have you been to any cons yet this year?
I have, well, not any significant ones. I saw a couple of the little, local kind of library hosted type ones. I think my first big one is actually going to be in a couple of weeks here with C2E2, which is local for me. And that's always a fun show. I get a lot out of that one. How about yourself?
Yeah, lucky you. I've always wanted to go to the C2E2. I just haven't been yet.
No, excellent show. Worth it if you're, certainly if you're in the area. I'd say worth it if you're not in the area too.
Yeah. I'd like to head up there at some point. And, both you and Gene live up in Chicagoland. So,
yes.
if I get up there, we can hang out and all that.
Yeah. And, it's not too far for, Gwen either, I don't think.
That's right. Yeah. I went to Fan Expo Dallas last weekend, which was a fairly big one. And that was pretty good. They had, tons of TV film people, but also this time around, quite an impressive list of writers and artists and even publishers in comics. And so I had a pretty good time there, recorded a few interviews and then put those up earlier in the week. Now in a about 2 months, I guess it is, I will be heading to Charlotte, North Carolina for Heroes Con, and Kunka's going to be there as well.
Excellent. I'd like to. I haven't been able to work that into my schedule yet. I'd like to, and I'm still looking to see if I can make it down this year, but I'm not sure yet. Still working on that, but I'd love to join you guys if I can.
Yeah. I was really this year wanting to go to TCAF. I've never been to that, but I just can't swing it. There's too much going on.
You know what? I have the same problem. I've been wanting to go to that for years, that it's always like, it always seems like there's something going on that I just can't make it for some reason.
Before we get into a discussion of this month's webcomics, let's just mention that listeners of the show may have noticed, or I guess they will have noticed, right? I mean, how could they not know that over the past, however many months it's been, 6 now?
Like
we've been talking with Paul Schultz and Jim McLean about getting their new webcomic, Poe and the Mysteriads, up off the ground. And when we first decided to talk with them, they were still in the formative stages. I think they had just a few pages that were drawn out, and they had a pretty solid sense of where they wanted to go and the kind of platform that they wanted to present this. And so over the past several months, then, we have been talking with, for the most part, both Paul and Jim, although there have been occasions where only Jim can make it, and just get an update about what it's like to start a new webcomic. Not only the things that you have to worry about in terms of the writing and the art, but also in terms of things like hosting, advertising, coming up with a schedule, to having to juggle, if there's more than one creator, as it is with those guys, their schedules. So, it was kind of an education for not only our listeners, but also for us, right? Because we talk about webcomics from a critical perspective. In talking with Paul and Jim, we got a creative perspective of what they have to go through. So along the way, we've been learning little bits of how this project has grown. And it just launched at the very beginning of this year. Listeners can find this on Facebook. If you go to facebook.com/Mysteriads, MYSTERIADS, then they can see that. And it's going to be on Facebook for a while before they get their main website up and running. But we mention all this because this month we're not going to be talking with Jim and Paul because they're already off the ground. They have things going. And what Sean and I thought we would do is, in the future, check in with them occasionally to find out what's going on. So instead of doing this conversation with those guys every month, we'll just come back to them every, few months or so and see how things are going.
Yeah, because I think part of the, like you said, a lot of the idea in the first place was to kind of get a behind-the-scenes look at getting things up and running, right? Because most readers aren't aware of webcomics, don't really see anything about the webcomic until it's launched. And we wanted to showcase that, there's all this prep work that goes into it well before, Joe Reader actually sits down to read the first installment. Since we're up and running, I think we've got a lot of good insights out of that, and maybe we can just check back in periodically, like you said, every few months and see how things are going. Cause you guys you can read the story as much as we can. You can see all of what goes into the day-to-day, week-to-week updates that they're already posting. So, we'll just kind of do some follow-ups periodically, as they keep going on the webcomic and as it, hopefully becomes more successful for them.
Well, Sean, let's get to the first webcomic that we're going to be discussing this month, and this is Conceptual Heist. This is by J.D.C. and Matt G. Gagnon. And this is, as the name suggests, a heist comic, although it is a heist narrative with a peculiar twist in that it's also a science fiction story.
Yeah, it's set in the year 2090. And obviously because of that, there's a lot of advanced technologies, being kind of casually thrown around that we just don't even, are barely even concepts today. Right. So, That puts an interesting twist on the heist motif, in that, if you think of your typical heist movie or TV show or comic or whatever, they're using typically contemporary technology, usually cutting edge, but contemporary technology, to try and thwart whatever, security measures have been put in place. This is kind of taking things a little bit differently by advancing all of the security measures and advancing all of the countermeasures at the same time, and trying to, hook part of the story around those technologies, I think, which is makes for an interesting difference than what you'd see in a typical heist type of story.
Exactly. Now, listeners can find this webcomic at conceptualheist.tumblr.com, and Conceptual Heist is one word, so conceptualheist.tumblr.com. And in fact, this is one of 2 Tumblr webcomics we're going to be looking at this month. And this one has been going on since April 2015. So I guess relatively speaking, it's a fairly new webcomic in that the story, we're already into the 3rd chapter, but it's a quick read. And by quick read, I don't mean that it's simple. It's not by any means. It's just there is enough there to really get a sense of what's going on. Like I said, we're already into the 3rd chapter, but it's not – there's not so much webcomic like the next one we're going to be talking about that it can be almost inhibiting, right? It's like, oh my God, I got, so many pages of this webcomic to keep up with. And the way that the creators, DC and Gagnon, put up Conceptual Heist is that each installment is a strip, and usually it's a strip of, let's say, 2 or 3 panels, depending. But it would be something akin to, let's say, what you would find in the comic section of newspapers. So then, and I think they're in the process of putting together a book, right? The first Conceptual Heist book, and they've described that what they're going to do, if I remember correctly, is to lay 3 of those strips one on top of the other, and that will compose one page.
Yeah, they've actually and they've actually got, at least as of this recording, they've got a Kickstarter running right now to publish that. So yeah, that's the
and it's funded.
Yeah, it's already funded. Excellent. Yes, good. I hadn't had a chance to look at it quite yet, but yeah, so the interesting thing I would be curious to see, and honestly I did not look to see this, is how they end up using color in this. Because one of the interesting kind of visual aspects to the story is that it's largely a black and white piece with a spot blue that's peppered throughout the story as kind of an accent color. Usually to focus on some of the advanced technologies that we're talking about. And I'd be curious to see if that translates into print as well. I don't know that it's necessary for the story, but it does provide an interesting visual interest that you don't typically see, I don't think.
I do think it is necessary for the story. So I would be surprised if in the print version of this, they did not retain the blue. Now, as you pointed out, the blue throughout the webcomic indicates the high tech aspect, right? So this is the sci-fi part of Conceptual Heist that really comes out. So, for example, whenever our protagonist, whose name is Gemma Heiss, not Heist, but Heiss, whenever she uses technology to mask herself when she's going in to, pick something up, let's say, that the color blue is used, for instance, to conceal her, or if she's wearing glasses, then the glasses become blue, and then the glasses also help to make her facial features less distinguishable. Or when she's looking through a particular kind of lens to see the painting, and it begins with the heist of the famous Picasso, the old guitarist. As she's looking through that technology to get a sense of what technology has been placed, right, by the owners of that painting against theft, it's in the color blue that we see this. And so if they do it in print without the color blue, really that wouldn't make sense to me, because I think that the blue is essential to the story.
It's certainly, I think it's used very well to highlight, like I said, the technology and some of the other elements throughout the story. But I don't know if it's necessary per se. In terms of, I think if you stripped it out, you could still read the story and it would be perfectly fine and you'd understand it. And, you could go through, and it'd be a perfectly fine readable story, just as it is on the website. But I think the use of color here does accent things a lot and heightens the reading experience a little bit more. It's certainly not going to be the same experience reading it black and white, but I don't think it impacts, like the basic narrative itself, I guess I should say.
Yeah. I guess maybe not the bedrock narrative, but I do think that without the color, we would be missing a lot of what's going on in Conceptual Heist. And again, as an example, let's use some of the most recent strips. Now, the latest one that went up was 2 days ago as we're recording this. So, the last installment they put up was on April the 6th. And at this point, Gemma is on a space casino, and she is wanting to steal some art that's housed at the casino. And what she's doing is wearing these glasses, a kind of a new technology that will fuzz out her face or make her features indistinguishable because, it's a casino and it's a high-tech casino. There are cameras everywhere. I mean, not only are people watching employees, but they have cameras all over the place. And so to normal vision, right, both real life and also through camera, she would appear a little more indistinguishable with these glasses on. Now, at some point after she puts those glasses on, she tells us something about those glasses. But before that, and I can't remember how many, but there are 2 or 3 panels where she puts the glasses on before we get any explanation of what they are. Now, they could be just a fashion assessment, but because when she puts them on, they're drawn in blue, I knew immediately this is high-tech stuff. And so little things like that. So I asked myself, if the artist stripped out blue from this comic, what would be lost? And I think that the more overt use of technology, a futuristic technology, which is, again, a significant part of what Conceptual Heist is all about. I think you would lose that. And you would have to fall back on other things besides color to indicate what you have here. It's like, okay, right now I'm going to put on, this kind of unique technology bodysuit, and this is what it does. So in other words, I think there would have to be more explanation, more exposition, more telling, in other words, instead of showing. And I think that the color blue goes a long way towards showing the technology in this story.
That is true. I will concede that point. Yep. I'll give you that.
But you were right in that they use it sparingly, and that's to its benefit, right? Mm-hmm. Something else about the style here, the black and white with the blue. I couldn't help but think of the aforementioned Poe and the Mysteriads, Paul Schultz's art, mm-hmm. because it's somewhat similar in that there is just black and white, so there's really no shades of gray in this comic. And the only other color that we have is the blue. But the way that – and which one is the artist? Is it DC or is it Gagnon?
You know what? I could not find definitive answer on that, but I believe it's Gagnon would be my guess.
So let's just say it's Gagnon's art. So I think the way that he uses black and white to create atmosphere is not dissimilar from the way that Paul Schultz does that in Poe and the Mysteriads.
Yeah. There's definitely, I think they both rely heavily or refer heavily to that kind of noir aspect of film in particular. There's a lot of, deep, dark, heavy shadows, with these solid blacks that seem to kind of envelop large sections of the page, mm-hmm. which I think works very well within both stories for slightly different reasons. Right. Within Conceptual Heist, obviously we're talking about a heist story, or actually a series of heist stories. So it plays into that noir aspect. You kind of get that kind of Maltese Falcon-ish kind of feel to things, right? Even though stylistically everybody's wearing, contemporary clothing and modern suits, and nobody has Stetsons on or anything like that. But they still it still conveys or harkens back to that kind of old style of storytelling. Again, with the heavy shadows and the deep receding backgrounds and that kind of thing.
Right. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're 3 chapters into this, and I like the way this story or this webcomic is breaking down so far in terms of how DC and Gagnon are giving us this information. So the first chapter, which is called Good Evening, Miss Heist, is installments 1 through 77. And in the first chapter, we're basically introduced to Gemma Heist, and she is stealing the old guitarist from a guy named Richards, right? So this rich guy. And we also know in this first chapter, we learn why she does this. And so this is not just someone who is doing this because she loves to steal. So this is not like a Catwoman or someone who is only doing it for personal gain, but there is a Robin Hood aspect to this. And this is something that Gemma tells us at the very beginning, is that she would only do this if she were stealing from, if the person she was stealing from were really, really rich and use that wealth to the harm of others ultimately. And so there is this Robin Hood side of Gemma that makes her a much more likable character. So this first chapter is an introduction to her and her making that first heist. We're also introduced to someone named Detective Noble, and he is someone that Gemma respects, but he is there at Richard's party to guard the painting and also just the premises. And so we also get to see how in this first chapter Gemma uses not only the technology but her wiles to get in, to get out, and to fool the authorities. The second chapter, which is called Moving Up, tells us a little bit more about Gemma and her background, what she currently does. She works for an art gallery. Her father is the founder of a big security company called Heist Security. We're also in chapter 2 introduced to someone by the name of Hanson Gao, and he is the current CEO of Heist Security. Now, Gemma's father has died, but Gemma's not the CEO of the company. And as she tells Hanson, she doesn't want to be the CEO, but she does have a good time kind of annoying him and pissing him off because he's very paranoid.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think works well about the series. Because when I first started reading it, I had a little concern that it was a little too focused on Gemma. Mm-hmm. And we didn't really have hardly any of a supporting cast, and that's workable, but I think it's hard to continue a story with exactly one character the entire time, and that's why you see, in a lot of stories, you really have to branch out. You even like something like The Punisher, which is by nature here, he's just one guy, one lone vigilante. He still ends up developing kind of this enclave of supporting characters. And I think when we get into chapter 2 a little bit more and we're seeing some of these other folks, I think that does help to play up her role a little bit, because she's not then walking around isolated by herself. She's actually talking with and interacting with other people, and we're actually able to see a little bit more of her personality and how she's acting and interacting with these others, how she's trying to either manipulate them or just communicate with them.
Right. Now, one person that we are introduced to in the first chapter is someone named Knox, and I can't remember Knox's first name. Can you?
Not off the top of my head, no.
No, and he's older than Gemma, and in fact, Gemma every now and again calls him Old Man. And he is an African American who, from what I can gather so far, has ties in the arts community. He seems to be kind of retired now, or he doesn't seem to be, at least on the surface, doing any work. But actually, Knox is working with Gemma in order to steal these paintings, and then he will fence them And so then he will give Gemma her cut from that. Now, we learn a little bit about Knox in chapter 1. We learn a little more in chapter 2. And then chapter 2 goes from pages 78 through 141. And one thing that surprised me in chapter 2 is when Knox referred to himself as an old cyborg. It's like, what? Because this is nothing that I got from the first chapter. And then right after that, you can see his hand. And yeah, it's a cybernetic hand. And so I was curious. It's like, okay, I know this is a futuristic heist narrative. And so it's set in the future. So why not cybernetics? That makes sense. But I would have thought that by that point, when he's referring to himself as a cyborg, or at least partly a cyborg, then what is the backstory here? Why does he have this hand? And I'm trusting DC and Gagnon to give us more information about Knox and his story later on. But that just seemed to come out of nowhere to me. What about you?
Yeah, well, I think that goes to a little bit of the using that first chapter to focus so exclusively on Gemma.
Yeah,
like you said, we did get introduced to Knox in that first story, that first chapter, but we didn't really get a whole lot about him. We knew he was a fence. We knew they had some kind of historical relationship that gone back. They've got some history there, but we didn't really know much more beyond that. And he really only comes up in the tail end of that first chapter, because even though Gemma is talking to him and communicating to him through her headset, her phone, whatever. We only hear her half of the conversation in all those cases, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't really get we get a brief introduction to Knox in that first chapter, but there's almost nothing there for him, or about him. So when we do get to chapter 2, and I think that sequence, if I recall correctly, happens when they're sitting down there eating together, having dinner or something, discussing this next plot that they're talking about, is when that kind of shows up. But that's, if you think about it, that's really the first time that we really get a sense of who Knox is when Gemma is completed that whole first mission, and that we do get to that. So it did come as a little bit of a surprise. I don't know if that was something that they had actually planned on putting in the story originally and just didn't get around to it, or if it was kind of a later addition. It struck me. It did strike me a little bit. I don't know that it's. It maybe could have been handled a little better or dropped in a little earlier, I suppose. But I think given the story of how the first chapter was set, I think it would have been hard to kind of fit that in without seeming forced. Right. At least in the context of that conversation, it at least felt natural enough that it was, it wasn't a conversation that seemed like they had to put it in for the express purpose of exposition, right?
Right.
It did feel like a natural conversation. I think it just, there wasn't maybe a good point in the story before then to really do something like that.
Yeah. Now, I do like this story, and I like where the webcomic is going, and I think that the pacing of the narrative works really well. I have to say, though, that one thing that annoyed me, and I do not use that word lightly, is that, and I think this primarily happened in the first chapter, the number of times that the story was interrupted for this or that, either an inclusion of fan art or a message from the creators about something that's going on or something that they're thinking about or some background context from their idea behind Conceptual Heist. One or two of those would have been one thing, but there was a span of several pages, almost one right after another, it seemed, where you would have, let's say, a couple of pages of story, and then you'd have an interruption with, I don't know, some kind of expository information, right? Or behind the scenes art or information. And then you'd have one or two pages of the story, and then you'd have fan art, and then one or two pages, and then something else. And this happened over a relatively short period of time. At a particular point in the story where there was a hot and heavy fight, where Jem was trying to get away. And I thought, my God, an action-packed moment in the story, and you keep interrupting it with these other things. And I understand why they may have to do that. And you could argue that some of those interruptions can help build a fan base and create community, and I understand that. It's just, it seemed to me irritating at the time that I was reading this. And so maybe if I were reading this as it was coming out, my thoughts would be different. But reading it almost all at once, right, over just a day or two period of time, it bugged me. And I kept asking myself, why don't they put these things on a different page within their Tumblr account? Because they, I guess, could easily do that. But then maybe those extras, right, the background information, the fan art and whatnot, is something that helps to build a community, which is what the things they wanted to do. But it did get in the way of the story.
Well, certainly reading it in retrospect like this, yeah, I totally agree with you like that. I kind of felt the same way. And I wonder if part of that is, and I haven't used Tumblr enough as a creator to know how easy this is to do, to be able to kind of separate out their story content from all other content, right? It seems like what they were doing is, hey, because we've seen this kind of thing before, right? Where for whatever life reasons that come up, you can't get a story update in place on your normal schedule. I get that. I'm fine with that.
Right.
And you and I have discussed that before. That happens. Life happens, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But where we've seen it typically in the past is that instead of interrupting the flow of the comic, they'll post something to their blog or what have you. So, your regular readers can get something and say, oh, here's a piece of fan art. Here's, some other piece that I had written up earlier as kind of a Bible or, whatever they're posting kind of content because they can't get the actual story update in place. But it's still somewhat separated from the story proper.
Right.
And we didn't see that here.
Right. You can easily do this on Tumblr, and I don't want to go into this now, but toward the end of this episode, we'll be discussing a webcomic that does just that on Tumblr. And so both Chris and Kyle Bolton do with Smash what you and I have been talking about that what DC and Gagnon need to do, or at least to consider, with Conceptual Heist also on Tumblr.
Yeah. But and to be fair, again, this is us reading it in retrospect, right? That's
a good point. That's a good point.
If you're reading that, on a weekly basis, on a regular update basis, that might not be as problematic because you've already got, you get to, like you said, that occurred during an action sequence. You've already, if you're reading it in time, you get to the end of that and that you've got at least, several days, if not a week before the next installment comes out anyway. So you've already kind of put a pause, I guess, on the story if you're reading it in that context. So that might have a slightly different reading experience than what you and I had.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point to make, and also it's something to keep in mind when we get to our next webcomic in a moment, is that we're reading these, or at least I'm reading these, in ways that are different from, I think, what most people experience. And, if our readers haven't realized this yet, Sean is the one of the two of us that has a lot of experience with webcomics. I've got some experience, but not near the experience that Sean does. And so the way that we usually work the show is, I think more times than not, Sean, you're the one who recommends a title. Every now and again, I'll come up with something, but I think mostly it's you. And these are webcomics that you were familiar with for the most part previously. You've been keeping up with on and off for a while. So you read them, let's say, as most of each webcomic's original fans do, right? On a regular or fairly regular basis. But when you recommend these to me, for instance, Conceptual Heist, then I'm not familiar with that. I go, okay, I'll look into this. And so I read it in one or two sittings, or at least I'll read it as a continuous story, as opposed to picking it up once, twice, maybe 3 times a week.
Yeah, and I think it's valid for both points to be brought up, though, because, almost, I think very few readers of any webcomic, even the big popular ones, started on day one, right? You find it at some point, maybe not, you don't go back, 5-10 years or something for some of these that we've looked at, but maybe you find it 2 months in, 3 months in, something like that. And if you're trying to get caught up, even just and to be a continuing ongoing reader, you still have to read those first, week, month, quarter, however long installments in one batch sitting like that. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think it's valid to discuss it from both perspectives, because that's, a webcomic creator's audience, right? Is they're appealing to not only their regular readers, the people who come back week in and week out and read one installment at a time as they come out, but it's like that old adage, every comic is somebody's first, right? Somebody is going to stumble upon Conceptual Heist here in installment, whatever, 146 or wherever we're at, because of this podcast, and I'll start reading it based on that. Somebody else might not listen to this podcast for another year and come to the Conceptual Heist, and it's, at installment 240 or whatever. And they're going to come to it like that. But then there's that one guy who came in at 146, and he's been reading it on a regular basis since then. So he's got that reading advantage from that perspective that the guy who comes in at 240 does not have, right? But that's always going to be the case. There's always going to be someone who comes to the webcomic sometime after it started and has to catch up or wants to catch up. So I think it's certainly a valid point to keep in mind as a creator that, that the way you're reading the comic, the way you're creating the comic isn't necessarily the same way that everybody is going to read the comic later.
Right. And, I think on that point, unless you have anything else for or on Conceptual Heist, that would be a great segue to our next title for this month, which is Ménage 3.
Yeah, let's get into them.
Yes, and this is a very famous webcomic, Ménage 3, and this is by Gisele Lagace and David Lumsdon. They go by the names Giz or Jiz. It wouldn't be Jiz.
It might be Jiz for this story, actually.
Okay, yeah, for this story, yeah. So either Giz or Jiz, and Dave Zero, which isn't a lower caloric Dave. But so, yeah, this is a webcomic that you can find at ma3comic.com, or if you put into your browser Ménage A3, and that's the number 3.net, then you can find it as well. And this is a story that's been going on since May of 2008. And so they have been around for quite a long time.
And this is, interestingly, this is one of these ones that actually you had suggested that we take a look at, and one that I was aware of, but I'd never actually sat down to read before. So kind of going back to our prior discussion, this is one that you and I both sat down to try and read whatever, the 1,200 some 1,300 installments of this in one go. And that is quite a feat. And I'll admit up front, I did not get through each and every one, I got to say.
Right. Yeah. And same. But yeah, the reason I recommended this is, like you, I knew of this and I'd heard quite a bit about it. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity to find out what Ménage 3 is all about. And so I recommended it to you, and, you had the same interest, right?
Yeah.
I've heard about it. I've wondered, so let's read it. And so my experience and Sean's experience in reading Ménage 3 is very different, I would guess, from the vast majority of its fans, especially those who have been there almost from the very beginning, because this webcomic is updated, about 3 times, ideally, 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Mm-hmm. And so over a week's period, people can get, usually 3 installments. Sometimes they may miss one and just have 2. But for the people who have been there throughout this entire time, they've seen this story unfold organically. And so their experience in reading Ménage A3 is very different from mine and Sean's, because when you sit down to read it, if not all in one go, then read it more continuously, right? So you read one strip and the next strip. In other words, we don't have to wait several days to get the next installment because there's, over 1,000 pages already there. You start to notice a particular pattern that becomes very predictable. And, you and I were talking before we turned on the mics today that many of these strips could stand on their own because they work from, if we can call it this, kind of a traditional gag format where by the time you get to the end of a particular page or a strip in this case, and they are laid out like strips, again, like Conceptual Heist, something like you might find in a newspaper. Many times there is this kind of joke or gag of some sort at the very end, but the strip fits into the larger story that's being told at that time. So to some degree, it can stand on its own, although it finds much more significance within the context of the ongoing storyline at the time. Mm-hmm. But there is a particular pattern and system to Giz and Dave Zero's storytelling that becomes very noticeable and at times, if I could say, kind of predictable and not as engaging. That's why I think if I had read this on a continuous basis, as it was coming out, or maybe let's say once a week, then I don't think I'd have this feeling. But reading everything over a concentrated period of time, then my experience just wasn't the same. I didn't like it as much, I think.
Well, let's take a step back for a second and fill people in who are not aware of the story. What the basic,
that's a good idea.
What the basic plot is, right? So the basic setup is there's a guy named Gary. He's in his 20s, trying to get by, trying to make it as a comic artist or whatever. And the story starts off. He discovers that his two roommates are in fact a gay couple. They had been hiding this from him previously.
Matt and Dylan,
yes. And they're going to now move out and find their own place. And they've already put in an ad in the paper for new roommates for this place that Gary's renting. And almost immediately, he has a couple of women show up, a girl by the name of Z, short for Susie, who's kind of a punk rocker kind of thing, currently unemployed. She comes in, seems to be a great fit. They get along very well.
And Gary's attracted to her. She has an interest in comics. There's a lot of kind of overlap in their interests. And almost as soon as Gary says, "Yeah, Z can stay here. You're a good fit," another person shows up, a woman named Dee Dee, who is also interested in who's short for Desiree.
Short for Desiree, thank you.
And she's French Canadian,
and strong as an ox and gorgeous as all get out, and to the point where both Gary and Z's jaws drop to the floor with how drop dead gorgeous this woman is.
Right.
And so then much of the story then revolves around the three of them just trying to live their lives, get by, but also with a lot of sexual interest, a lot of sexual overtones throughout the entire thing. Gary at this point at the start of the story is a virgin, and Z takes it upon herself to make sure he stays a virgin no longer. And this partially challenged by Dee Dee having this string of boyfriends that come in with very thin walls and, trying to circumnavigate that world that she's she has a bit of a naivete about her because of her extreme beauty. She's not used to rejection. She's not used to being pleasured herself because guys apparently have this habit of
coming and going and going and coming.
Yeah, exactly.
As Mel Brooks put it in Blazing Saddles.
There you go. Exactly. So then there's some, she has some emotional issues to deal with there, right? And so the story revolves primarily around the three of them who stay roommates. We're almost 10 years into the story. They're still roommates together. And so the story is the three of them trying to get by, trying to figure out their lives, et cetera, et cetera. But like I said, there's kind of a very strong sexual bent to it. I think the Wikipedia entry makes reference to a similar setup and concept as Three's Company, the old TV show.
Right.
Only with more nudity and stronger language. It's stuff you couldn't get away with on network television in the 1980s.
Oh, and very explicit stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not just, mild sex, but yeah, I think that if you're going to describe Ménage 3, and do so by comparing it to other narratives in either the comics medium or otherwise, then Three's Company, I think, is a good one to turn to, right? Mm-hmm. And, there is something really bawdy about Three's Company. And I remember as a kid growing up and not really liking Three's Company because the humor just struck me as easy and cheap. Mm-hmm. Not anything that you would have to think about, which, for the audience, apparently they loved it. And to me, it just struck me as the kind of humor that we would see later in the 80s with Married with Children, right? That wasn't very sophisticated by any stretch of the imagination. So there's something about Three's Company-ish about this. But there's also something very much Archie-like about this, especially in the art.
Yeah.
And in fact, is it Gisele Lagace who does the art? Mm-hmm. You could look at this, and I think she's actually done work for Archie, if I'm not mistaken. But you could look at this, and you can see the heavy influence of Archie here. But let's say an Archie that's been heavily infused with manga.
I don't recall any tentacle porn issues coming up in Archie, as I recall.
Yeah. Or even outside of that, there are occasions where one of the characters will look all googly-eyed, and you'll see that they have this kind of cute moe style to them.
That's true.
Then into their eyes. And then every now and again, the characters are drawn, let's say in a small insert panel in miniature in an overt manga manner, where they look very iconic, not as much detail. And it looks like something that you would find from, a manga for a younger audience, except in this case, it's the tone is very adult. So there's something manga influenced by this. But, I couldn't help but think of another comic as I was reading Ménage 3, and that is Terry Moore's Strangers in Paradise. Mm-hmm. And, part of the reason may be because I saw Terry again and even interviewed him at the Fan Expo Dallas last weekend. But, and I'm a big fan of Strangers in Paradise, but I do think that even if that wasn't on my mind recently, then I would have thought of Strangers in Paradise because it has a similar setup, right? Because in Strangers in Paradise, we also have a story, an ongoing story of friendship, kind of a romantic comedy, if you want to call it that, based on three main characters. And in Strangers in Paradise, it's Kachu, it's Francine, and then David. In Ménage 3, we have Gary, Z, and Dee Dee. And of course, there are other characters that come into play in both Ménage 3 and Strangers in Paradise, but they're more supportive in terms of what they tell us about the interaction between the main three, with Ménage 3, Gary, Z, and Dee Dee. And so it's about the complications of their relationship, romance. Different people are attracted to and or seeing others at one point, and then another character is involved with maybe the same individual at another point. So you've mentioned that, we've had this webcomic for not quite 10 years now. And so there's plenty of time for things to have evolved. And you can see where the characters start out, where they go, how they change, and how relationships become kind of fluid. Someone will, like someone here, and then another time like someone else. And so I think, coming back to an earlier point that I made, keeping up with this as it was coming out, I think I could appreciate that ongoing drama kind of aspect more than I did in reading it within a concentrated period of time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The challenge I ran into is, or one of the challenges I ran into is seeing or trying to follow that narrative without having the time to kind of sit back and reflect on the individual characters, right? Even if you're reading something like Strangers in Paradise, which honestly, I made that connection before I made a connection to Archie, honestly, with the story.
Okay.
Because the connection with Archie is more just in the kind of the visual itself. The style is very reminiscent.
Although you do have a three, right? You have Archie, Veronica, and
there's that kind of
Betty.
trio. You do have that trio, and then there's certainly a Dan DeCarlo influence in the art. But I definitely picked up on the Strangers in Paradise thing a little bit more heavily. But where I was able to get more invested in those characters was because even reading that in the trade paperback experience, like I did, it was still, there was still a little bit of a staggering in that, you'd read one trade paperback and put it down and then come to the next one a month later or a week later or whatever it was, sometime later. And you were able to sit back and, reflect on what was happening and what the characters were going through, right? Cause some of it was explicit. Some of it was subtext. Some of it you kind of had to think on a little bit. And I think there's some of that going on here, but in sitting down and reading, 400, 500 strips in a single sitting, I didn't have time to do that. Right. So I don't think I was able to kind of invest myself in the characters because I was trying to read so much in one sitting. Mm-hmm. And therefore the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows of their relationships didn't seem as important to me because I wasn't able to kind of reflect on that and invest myself in the characters as much, trying to read all that in one sitting.
Right. But, something, again, we were making comparisons to other stories, right? Three's Company, Strangers in Paradise. Another difference between Ménage 3 and Strangers in Paradise is that in the latter, the characters are drawn much more broadly. And I'm not talking about the literal art style. I'm talking about how their personalities are represented. So, every now and again, there will be some texture or some subtlety in who these characters are. But I think it's really easy to describe these characters with just a few words or phrases. So, for instance, Gary, nerd. Right? A shy, innocent nerd. Now, as the story goes on, he loses his virginity, arguably becomes less innocent. But even in the most recent stories, in fact, the latest strip that went up just the other day, there is still this kind of almost ignorant innocence that by this point you would think he would have put at least somewhat behind him. Mm-hmm. But I think this kind of shy nerd is an easy way to describe him. Z, they're just a few words, punk girl, energetic, lets things go, does her own thing. And then Dee Dee. And with Dee Dee, I think there are certain defining characteristics of her that are, again, kind of broadly presented. Well, one is her French accent, right? She's French Canadian. And so that's one of the things that defines her is the way that she speaks, which I think it's very endearing. And it's not only endearing for me as a reader, but also it's endearing to others around her, the characters in the story. But by far the feature, or let's say features that define her more than anything are her breasts. And this is something that if Gisele Lagace was not one of the creators here, and it was like two guys who did this webcomic, I may have a little more problem with this, because by no means and no stretch am I Puritan in any way whatsoever, right? I can be bawdy and appreciate sexual situations and sometimes explicitness, just as many can. But in many cases in Ménage 3, to me, the situations just seemed a little too obvious, too overt. I don't want to say gratuitous, because I think this is one of the big draws, right? That people read this largely for the sex. Mm-hmm. And I would say, and I don't mean to belittle this webcomic by saying this, but I think that more people read it for the sex than they do the story, because the sex has more going for this than the story does in Ménage 3.
You know, I would agree with you up to a point, though, in that the interesting that while there's some very NSFW material here, right? The vast majority of the sexual content in this story is some TNA, right? We don't, even when we're seeing characters having intercourse, there's certain, anatomy is hidden, right? You know, we don't see the actual intercourse itself, at least in any of the strips that I read. And admittedly, I did not read them all, but all the intercourse scenes that I did see, they were clearly having sex, but there was something conveniently in the way, sometimes just a word balloon or something, right? But, so there's some level of interest in sex, but if you were interested solely in the sexual aspects of it, I think you'd be better served by reading actual porn comics. Right. So I think there's some level of the readership here. I think there must be some level of interest in the characters in the story, you know, and something beyond just the sexual, tone and the double entendres and all that. I think there is a little bit more there than, you know, for the audience than just that.
Well, you know, maybe I wasn't clear, but when I said sex, I didn't mean, you know, the actual physical act of sex. I mean, we see some of that in this webcomic, and you're right. We don't see any like penetration, explicitly. I meant sexual situation, right? So it could be something like two people having sex, you know, man and or woman together, or anything dealing with sex. So for instance, the number of times that characters, male and female, touch, lean against, put their mouth around, or comforted by, or what have you, Dee Dee's breasts, either naked or clothed. It's almost as if, you know, every few panels someone does that. And so that's what I mean by sex as well. And again, the characters here, especially Dee Dee, but others as well, I think are highly sexualized. And so if listeners have a problem with comics, not just webcomics, but any kind of visual storytelling where women's bodies are idealized in unrealistic ways, this may not be the webcomic for them. That didn't bother me about Ménage 3. I think that it was just the kind of story that's being told. Reading it within a concentrated period of span of time is why I couldn't engage with it like a lot of people do. Because again, this is a very popular webcomic.
Yeah, it certainly is. And you know what? One of the things I will say is probably also help it is there actually is a fair amount of body representation in there. You know, like we've said, Dee Dee is very hyper realistic, not hyper realistic, I suppose, but idealistically drawn. You know, very large breasts, very curvy, very, you know, voluptuous lips, etc. But she's really the only character drawn in that manner, right? Z is relatively flat chested, fairly skinny. Well, yeah, I mean,
I think she's drawn sexual. I think that even almost every minor female character in Ménage 3 is drawn in a particular way that sexualizes them in ways that are to some degree non-realistic. And again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a turnoff for me in this webcomic. It's just that that's what I observe here. Yeah,
and all I'm saying is that she is drawn in a sexual way, but not in the same way that Dee Dee is drawn, right?
No.
Yeah, you know, Dee Dee is drawn in this kind of stereotypically idealized male fantasy character, right? And many of the other female characters, or most of the other female characters, are drawn a little bit more normally in terms of proportions and size and stature and that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, they're certainly drawn in a very, all the characters are drawn very sexually, pretty much all the time. But I mean, like in the current strip we're looking at, Gary is naked for a bit. and he looks just like a naked guy, right? I mean, just like an average guy, right? There's not these hyper muscles all over the place. There's not ripped abs. There's not, he's not fat. He's not overweight. He's just a guy, and he's drawn as just a guy. And I see that a lot with a lot of the female characters too, is right. Okay. Yeah. She's got breasts. She's got hips and whatever, but they're not over accentuated. They're not, they're drawn proportionally fairly realistically, even if she's in a, you know, scantily clad nurse bikini or something, you know. The Super Mario Brothers costumes they had at one point were a little disturbing, but they were still, they were drawn as kind of regular women, right? You know, they were still drawn as, okay, yeah, that I could picture that woman. I know someone with that body type, right? I don't think I've ever met anybody with Gisele or, with, Dee Dee's body type. So yeah, you know, that's where I'm going with. They're certainly sexually depicted, but there's a range of body representation in that regard.
Yeah. And you know, another thing that I think works to Menage a Three's benefit is the fluidity of sexual attraction that goes on here, right? So, I mean, even though, you know, Gary likes women, there are parts in the story where he kind of wrestles with the fact that his former roommates, Matt and Dylan, are, you know, one is attracted to the other. And in fact, with one of them, even teaches him how to kiss, right? Dressed as a woman. And so Gary wrestles at one point with the idea, am I gay because a guy is teaching me how to kiss? And when he dresses as a woman, you know, this Amber character, you know, and I'm attracted to him. Does that make me gay? So there's some of that. And then there's Z, who is attracted both to men and to women. And in fact, as you pointed out, Z has a thing for Dee Dee, just as Gary does. And then even with Dee Dee, she's someone who has, at least at first, primarily defined herself as straight and engaged with men, but she has a problem in her relationship with men, is that the men, and again, how do we put this, become so excited that they are not around long enough, so to speak, to satisfy her. And so when we first meet Dee Dee, she reveals to Z that she hasn't had an orgasm and that a guy has not been able to satisfy her in this way. Well, in the most recent series of strips, Dee Dee becomes involved with someone who actually is a past girlfriend of Gary's, and that is Kylie. And Kylie is a psychology student at McGill University. And Dee Dee feels that she has a real relationship with Kylie, but that doesn't turn out. And she is distraught by that because Kylie was able to satisfy Dee Dee in ways that relationships with men didn't in the past. And so it's this fluidity of attraction and of sexual orientation to some degree, I think, that makes this, I think that adds to the drama of this story. And I think one of the big draws for Menage a Three has been going on for so long. It's like a soap opera. And so you have almost a set number of characters, but the set number of characters individually and in their relationships one to the other kind of evolve and change into different things as the story develops.
Yeah. And I think I think honestly, that was one of ultimately part of the problem I had with that too, is the same thing I have with, same issue I have trying to get into soap operas, is the central cast is essentially the same, and they at the start developed this sexual tension between the three of them, hence the name. And here we are 10 years later, and that hasn't been resolved yet. Right. You know, we've still got Z trying to figure out if she's going to try to go to bed with Gary, and Gary is being courted now by Dee Dee, who is, you know, he was originally interested in her when she first walked in the door, but now that, you know, he had other experiences since then. And there's this kind of a cycle of kind of spinning around and around and around, and not going anywhere. And that's sort of what I saw with like I said, soap operas as well, right? These characters, you just kind of spin the wheel a little bit and the characters all shift, and okay, everybody move one plate down and just go with whatever's in front of you. And I got a kind of a sense of that here, but 10 years on and we've never gotten back to base zero, basically, right? Mm-hmm. Where we're still having the same conversation almost, a decade on with the same characters.
Exactly. Yeah. But again, I think that maybe not for you or for me, but I think for many of Menage a Three's readers, that's what they like about that, right?
Sure.
There's comfort in the fact that certain things in a narrative doesn't change. It's kind of like, again, coming back to the soap opera analogy, it's like a good old soap opera, right? Yeah, things will change, but ultimately, when it comes right down to it, the premise doesn't really move that much.
Right.
It's something you can always count on. And I think that for regular readers of Menage a Three, what is comforting to them may not be more appealing to us, more or less.
Yeah. And that may, as we kind of started the conversation with this too, and part of that might be just that because of how we're coming to this, right? We're coming to this 10 years on, trying to read these in large chunks instead of on a more regular basis. Three times weekly basis. Mm-hmm. Because we're seeing these in one large chunk, we're able to see these patterns in a way that you wouldn't see if you tried to keep up on a regular basis, or they wouldn't be as overt, I guess, as you would see on a regular basis.
Well, Sean, you want to move on to the last webcomic that we're looking at this month?
Absolutely. Let's take a look. Monstrous by Chris Bolton and Kyle Bolton, right?
Right. And this is part of their Smash comic. And this is my first introduction to the character Smash and the webcomic Smash. But and you're the one who introduced me to this. You told me to check it out, but you have a longer history with this webcomic, even a book that was published by Candlewick Press in 2013 that spun off from, or I guess was the first main story of this webcomic, right?
Yeah, they started this several years ago. I think it was probably 2011, 2012, somewhere in that range. And as they were just developing this webcomic about this kid who got superpowers and is 10-year-old kid trying to figure out how he's a superhero, et cetera, and it was a cute, clever story. I was enjoying it and read that as an ongoing webcomic. And at some point while they were working on it, Candlewick Press had seen it, or somebody at Candlewick Press had seen it and said, "Hey, that's really good. Let's publish that." And so they signed a deal with Candlewick. And once the webcomic ended, went over to Candlewick. They printed up. It's in bookstores. You can find it on Amazon, whatever. But then they took the primary webcomic, the original webcomic, they took that down from the website to try and, prevent people, I guess, basically from reading the site for free when they're trying to sell it at the same time, right?
Right.
It's not uncommon.
Yeah, a lot of webcomic creators and publishers do that.
Yeah, not uncommon at all. And so in the interim since then, they started working on another book, again with Candlewick, I believe. But they're trying to do, a graphic novel, 150, 200 pages, whatever. And that takes some time. And that's where we kind of lead into, this Monstrous webcomic that we're talking about today. Is they knew their fans are sitting out here waiting. They developed whatever fan base they had, and they, knew that their fans were looking for more stories about this character. More stories set in this universe. And they provided, they did this little 27 pager, to kind of just say, here, we haven't forgotten about you guys. Here's a little short story about the character, just to kind of tide you over while we're still working on the book. So they put this out, when was it? A year and a half ago, I think, something like that.
This actually, and we should mention that people can find this at smashcomic.tumblr.com. Mm-hmm. That's one word, smashcomic.tumblr.com. And this started in May 2015, and it ended in November of that same year.
Yeah. Yeah. Although interestingly, that's, a year and a half, and I think on their Facebook page, maybe it was Twitter or something, as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, they're still working on the book. So the second volume of the book isn't out yet. That's still being worked on. But if you're interested, as a reader to see what we're talking about, you can check out this little 27 pager and get a quick summary of the character and the style and setup of that they're putting together here.
Right. Now, on the second page of on the Monstrous story is where I think what both Chris and Kyle Bolton, and are they brothers, I'm assuming?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. What the Bolton brothers have done really nicely is in that one panel give us the necessary information, in other words, the exposition, for us to understand what's going on in this story. So and this is the information that, according to you, was in that first book that they did, the first webcomic that then they turned into a book with Candlewick. Mm-hmm. And so we're introduced to the main character. Now, his name is Andrew Ryan, and when we first see him, and again, this is on the second page of the webcomic, he says, "Woohoo! Feels so good to fly. Can't believe it's only been a week since I got these powers." And then we have a series of inset panels that accompany what he says next. Of course, I wish Defender didn't have to die in that explosion. Hard to believe the world's greatest hero could be tricked by an evil chump like the Magus. Then Defender's powers landed right on me, a 10-year-old kid. Now I've got super strength and speed, and I can fly, just as long as I don't fly too high. Lucky for me, I still had my Defender costume from last Halloween. Now, everybody calls me Smash. One little screw up, and I'm cursed for life. Still, with these superpowers, how can anything go wrong? I don't think they could have summarized and set up what Smash is all about any better than they did in this one page.
Yeah,
visually and even in terms of text.
Yeah, it is a fantastic, quick setup. Like I said, they had this, whatever it was, 150, 200 page comic that was already out there, and they condensed it down to one page, less than one page. And everything that you need to know, everything that distills the character, distills the story, is right there. You don't need to get into a long additional origin story. You don't need to get a long history of the battles he fought or whatever. It's like, okay, he's a 10-year-old kid. He inherited his powers from the Defender who died, so he doesn't even have a mentor anymore. He's got his costume because he was a fan of the guy in the first place. There's all of that information is really packed in very nicely. It was very well done, I think, introduction for the character.
Right. Now, Chris Bolton is the writer and Kyle is the artist. And, Kyle, if you look on the bios page of this Tumblr site, has, good information about who these people are. And Kyle has a background in let's say 2D and 3D animation. He's also worked for game companies, and you can really tell by his art. This is really polished stuff. You can tell that he has experience with animation because even though, the webcomic is a two-dimensional platform here, he does bring to his art a kind of depth and kinesis that I think really pops out of the computer screen.
Yeah, there's definitely, he clearly spends a lot of time and money and effort from his back history just in studying, visual representations and layout and structure and that. And he puts a lot of thought into the page layout because of that, right? Not just, okay, I need to have this character hitting that character or looking at this way or that way, but even the overall, the page layout and design, there's a visual sense that he's got that, encapsulates the entire structure of a page even. I'm looking at he's got a panel here with, Smash is flying in the sky, over the city, looking down on this giant Godzilla-like creature who's destroying the town. And there's just like this nice circular motion that your eye gets flowing from, the central character over the monster's tail to the monster himself, back through the debris, then leads back up into the foot of Smash again, right? And it's just, it's a very nicely designed layout, and page. And that sense of flow that you get, really works well. And I think really speaks to the art, education and study that he's clearly put into this.
Right.
And I think that shines through very well.
Yes, and the art has that kind of all-age quality to where not only the content but also the art, I think, every reader can appreciate, right? So it's the art is something that younger readers will definitely gravitate toward, but it's not the kind of simple, drawn only for kids kind of art where adult readers will be a little put off. I mean, it's very engaging. The story is also engaging. Now, as you mentioned, this is, I guess we could call it a mini Smash story to kind of fill in between two longer Smash stories. Mm-hmm. And this one is fairly straightforward. You mentioned a Godzilla or dragon-like creature. So we have Smash, who finds that there's this Godzilla-like creature, this monster that is terrorizing the city, and he begins to prepare to battle this monster. But then, all of a sudden, this team of fighters called Monster Fighters shows up, and Smash wonders, wow, who are these guys? Why hadn't I heard of them? And so they're fighting the monster, and it appears that they put the monster down. But then Smash learns, and this is not a spoiler by any means, that the Monster Fighters actually are actors just as that monster was. Or so they thought, because this is where the aforementioned villain, Magus, comes into play. And we learn that actually Magus is behind this monster creature, this Godzilla-like figure, and things begin to go wrong. So, it's a relatively simple setup, and I think, but is handled very adeptly, and it's something that you could deal with in just a relatively short span. So it's a really nicely drawn, nicely written, compact, short piece.
Yeah, and I think I think that it's a nice standalone, right? And it serves, yes, I think, as a fantastic introduction to the character and kind of the concept and the world that he lives in, right? Because we've got the main villain, interestingly, even though Magus is behind it, the main villain is a henchman of Magus, or associate of Magus's, named, and I can't find it offhand, but it's like the Crimson Glove or something like that.
Yeah, it's something like that. And he has illusions of grandeur, right? So he wants to be as big as his boss.
Right. Where is that? I'm trying to, anyway. But it's so, which means that, it also doesn't necessarily need to pick up into the next story, right? You don't need to know this extensive history of the Magus character that we saw before. Right. The Crimson Fist, that's the name of the character. He comes in, he does his thing. He's working at his own agenda that kind of works alongside Magus's, but not really. But it's still simple and straightforward enough that, it's not like this convoluted Dr. Doom-ish level plan where X, number of dominoes have to fall before something happens to Reed Richards or anything like that, right? It's really basically just, Magus said, hey, do this. Crimson Fist said, yeah, I can do that. Oh, and if I do that, I will get some extra money out of the deal too. And Smash comes in and says, oh, I'm going to beat the snot out of you and fix this. And it seems like a simple, straightforward premise, but it's almost done in such a charming fashion and well executed fashion that it's just a good, solid story in and of itself.
Right. And the word charming works really well with this webcomic.
Yeah, I think that's a real strong selling point. It's one of those that, like you said, it's kind of seems to be geared for a young adult audience or a child audience, but it doesn't talk down to them at any level, which means that as an adult, you can sit down and read that pretty enjoyably too. It's a little like watching Sesame Street, right? There's stuff in there that the kids are going to love. They're going to be laughing at some of the silliness and that, and the adults are sitting back snickering at some of the other jokes that might go over the kids' head. And it's all done in a nice kind of eloquent, simplistic is not the right word. I mean, it's simplistic in the appearance, but there's a lot of subtlety that goes in behind that kind of belies that simplicity. And it's not complex, but it has a nuance to it that enhances the reading.
Kind of a rounded cartoonishness, right? So it's something that would definitely appeal to younger readers. But again, I mean, there's something, as you pointed out, and I've mentioned, that adults can enjoy as well. Mm-hmm. Another thing I really enjoyed and appreciated about this webcomic is how the website was designed and what kind of options we get. Now, we mentioned toward the beginning of the show when we were discussing Conceptual Heist, which is also on Tumblr, that that the creators could, if they wanted, include, let's say, a separate blog or additional pages where they could put things like fan art or contextual information, drawings that they don't use, things of that sort, and not necessarily interrupt the flow of their story, if they wanted to do that. And you were asking, I wonder if it can be done on Tumblr. Well, yes, it can. And this is something that the Bolton brothers absolutely do, because they have things really well organized. So the main site itself is the webcomic, first and foremost, right? So that's what's right up front. So if you click on the home page, or, which is, again, smashcomic.tumblr.com, that's what you're going to get. But they also have a blog where they, I can't remember when the last time they posted something, but, they would occasionally put things up that wasn't a part of the webcomic proper. There's also an about page, a page of author bios, summaries of some reviews that they've received, something for their Patreon campaign, and then an archive. And so they really make it easy to organize and find information. Now, I didn't mention this when we were discussing Ménage 3 because I felt that it may have sounded like I was a little too critical of Ménage 3, and maybe I was. One of the things I did not like about this webcomic was the design of the site. I think that the bottom half of the screen underneath the strip proper is visually busy, but again, I can see why they're going for that because of other creators sharing links, ads, and things of that sort. But for me, the most important thing that I found disappointing was if you click certain links to, let's say, the cast to get a summary of the cast, or the archive especially, right? It leads nowhere. I get a message, module not found. And this may be just a temporary glitch, and it could be something recent. I don't know. But it was difficult to get through Ménage 3 unless I went through it sequentially. In other words, I couldn't go to their archive and go forward or backward. And so it was difficult to navigate. And they don't have, at least as of now, a cast page that functions well enough. Now, they have a forum, they have a store, and, that's about it.
I think that's a recent issue, as I know when you and I first started discussing whether or not we should tackle this about a month ago or so, I know I looked at the site then, and the archive page was working at that point.
Okay, so maybe it's just temporary.
So I think that might be a temporary and fairly recent problem. I ran into the same issue as I was trying to catch up the past week or so. I don't know how long that's been an issue, but I know when I looked at it, like I said, about a month ago, everything seemed to be working fine at that point.
Yeah. But, getting back to Smash, this is really organized and laid out well, in addition to being a good, solid webcomic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a lot of fun. And, at 20 some odd pages, 27, 30 pages, it's a nice quick read too, right? If you want to sit down and just kind of sit through a nice heroic adventure with a fun-loving kid who's trying to figure out what the heck is going on, I think this is right. This is perfect material for that.
Right. Well, Sean, for the month of April, we looked at JDC and Matt Gagnon's Conceptual Heist. After that, we took a gander at Ménage 3 by Gisele Lagace and David Lumsdon. And then we wrapped up with a short completed webcomic by Chris and Kyle Bolton, Smash, the story Monstrous. So, 3, I think, really engaging, really interesting webcomics. And even if we may be critical of one or two, like, for instance, I think, we were saying a couple things about Conceptual Heist or some criticism of Ménage 3, we should point out to our listeners that we don't discuss things that we wouldn't want to read and recommend to others ourselves. And just because we have some issues with an aspect or a facet of a narrative doesn't mean that we don't like the comic. So I think all 3 of these are definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, and the other thing I should mention too, this is, your and my personal taste, right?
Yeah,
and
taste comes into play, certainly.
Taste comes into big play here, I think. And I think that's, there's a lot of stuff out there that just doesn't click for whatever reason, but we can still say, you know what, that's still well done. That's executed well, just not my thing. And that's fine. But like you said, we wouldn't put it out there. We wouldn't put it on this show if we didn't think it had something worth looking at.
Right. It's got the comics alternative stamp of approval.
Absolutely.
And what else has the comics alternative stamp of approval is our sponsor, of course, and that is Discount Comic Book Service, as well as their sister company, My Digital Comics. So if you want hard copy comics, definitely go to dcbservice.com, or if you like your storytelling digitally, then mydigitalcomics.com. Either way, you're making a great choice. And then after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's webcomics episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you'd like to send us an email, perhaps you've got a webcomic you'd like us to check out. That's how we heard about Conceptual Heist, as a matter of fact. You can email us at twoguys, TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly at Sean@comicsalternative.com.
Or email me at Derek@comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
Always nice to have a nice central location for all of that stuff. Makes it easy to remember, too.
Yeah, that's right. And we do like to hear from you, so whether you do so via email or Twitter or Facebook, or even we've been getting lately a number of comments through our YouTube channel where people will consume the podcast through YouTube and make comments there. So I don't know if we've gotten any for the webcomic episode on YouTube, but we do appreciate the messages any way that you want to deliver them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let us know what you think.
That's right, and we will be back next month with more webcomic goodness. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we'll see you next month.